Okay. We've got around, I think now I can see around 55 people on here, so that's fantastic. So I'm Anna McMorrin, MP, Member of Parliament for Cardiff North, and I'm also the Shadow Minister for Development, International Development. Very pleased to be here with the Foreign Policy Centre to chair this session. I was appointed as Shadow Minister back in April when Keir became leader, Keir Starmer became the leader. And since then, it's been, hitting the ground running, particularly on issues around the Middle Eastern region and specifically on Lebanon. So we know that this is an area that has been talked about, and particularly with COVID, we're seeing, and of course the blast last summer, we're seeing real exacerbated issues in the region, in the country. And I'm really pleased to be here with, you'll hear my cat meowing in the background, apologies for that. And really pleased to be here with some experts to talk about the issues. So I'm going to introduce you all, but give you a chance to open with some introductory remarks. So on the panel, I'm really pleased to have Professor John Nagle, Professor of Sociology at Queen's University Belfast, Dr. Ibrahim Halawi, Teaching Fellow in International Relations at Royal Holloway, University of London, Leila Malana Allen, freelance foreign correspondent in Beirut and reporter for PBS NewsHour and BBC Radio, and Sami Attallah, former director at the Lebanese Centre for Policy Studies. So, Professor John Nagle, can we start with you? Over to you to give some introductory remarks.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Anna. And thank you for inviting me to give a very kind of brief presentation. Just give you a bit of information on my background. As a sociologist, I've worked on issues related to kind of power sharing in divided societies. So beginning with Northern Ireland and then looking at it comparatively in a range of other divided societies, which would include Lebanon. So, what I'm kind of fascinated in looking at are a number of issues. One is why power sharing has become its main institutional tool to end civil war and interstate conflict. So it's, international community is increasingly using power sharing, and we can see this in places like Lebanon, Bosnia, Northern Ireland, Iraq, and it's suggested for Syria and a range of other places, especially in the Middle East at the moment. And what we've kind of seen with kind of power sharing over the last kind of 10 to 20 years is it's become an increasingly kind of complex beast. So it's not just about the incorporation of sectarian and ethnic identities, it takes into account issues of demilitarization, security sector reform, cross-border institutions, which we've seen in Northern Ireland. So, I mean, there's obviously some really kind of beneficial aspects of power sharing. And one of them is we know as academic from scholarly research and empirical research shows that exclusion of minorities is dangerous to stability. So exclusion creates grievances that lead these minorities to rebel. So what power sharing does, it kind of incentivizes minorities to abandon violence for peaceful participation by giving them guarantees of representation in government. And I suppose another kind of pro about power sharing is that through kind of encouraging elite level cooperation, theoretically, this can have a long-term benefit on the erosion of cleavages. So there's obviously, some strong, there's a strong kind of logic in arguing for kind of power sharing. However, as we know, there's definitely a kind of a dark side to kind of power sharing, but it can exacerbate and entrench ethnic and sectarian identities. It can weaken kind of state capacity, so it encourages corruption, clientelism. And also, which is something which I'm really kind of interested in, is while it includes kind of sectarian and ethnic groups, there's also a question of exclusion. So, you know, what happens to the inclusion of women, LGBTQ populations in Lebanon? We can think about migrants and refugees. So just to kind of tie this into kind of Lebanon, you know, obviously we can see why kind of power sharing has been practiced in Lebanon. It's been practiced since the kind of Ottoman era through kind of different phases, you know, since the end of the Civil War, since the end of Second World War, and so on. So I'm thinking of kind of Kamal Salibi's kind of famous book, a Lebanese historian, who said Lebanon is a house of many mansions. And what he meant by this is basically that Lebanon has all of these kind of sectarian groups who have very kind of different visions of kind of state ownership and state legitimacy. And what power sharing does, it creates this kind of balance of power between these groups. So no group can dominate the state over one group. So we can see the kind of logic of kind of power sharing in Lebanon, but we also need to be attuned to these really kind of systemic kind of issues about the exacerbation of sectarian identities. Since Taif agreement in 1989, we've seen you know, sectarian-based representation become increasingly kind of invasive and pervasive across governance through the civil sector and public sector and so on. We've obviously seen major issues in relationship to kind of corruption and clientelism, and we still have these kind of major issues about, you know, the participation of women in Lebanon's power sharing institutions. Lebanon, you know, while it's kind of progressive in terms of kind of, you know, women in many kind of ways, at the same time, you know, Lebanon is one of the worst countries in the world in terms of women's participation in, you know, power sharing institutions. You know, we see the exclusion, the violent exclusion of LGBT communities, kafala, domestic migrants, refugees, and so on. So of course, the big question is, you know, where to go forward. I'm not Lebanese, I'm not here to kind of suggest what the Lebanese should be doing, but I think there's, you know, a number of different aspects. One is, can power sharing be reformed? Can we come up with a more sort of liberal kind of hybrid system which takes into account issues to do with gender equality, LGBTQ rights, rights for refugees? It's also kind of questions about, you know, external actors. How can Lebanon maintain its sort of power sharing system without being too reliant on external actors? You know, historically Saudi Arabia, Iran, and so on. And finally, you know, I suppose another option is, you know, just to get rid of power sharing altogether, to move towards, you know, a so-called kind of secular system. I'm not entirely sure whether that's completely sort of realistic in the kind of current environment, but I think, you know, there is an opportunity there for a transition towards a more sort of liberal and hybrid power sharing form. So anyway, I'll stop here because I've probably taken up far too much time already.
Thank you very much. That, you know, you threw up some very interesting issues and discussions which we can debate further. Just a reminder for those watching, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box and there'll be an opportunity to go through a Q&A session after the speakers. So I want to turn to Dr. Ibrahim Halawi, Teaching Fellow in International Relations at Royal Holloway. Dr. Ibrahim.
Thanks, Anna. Thanks for hosting and for inviting me. So just to add to the introduction about myself, and then I'll get on with my notes. I research revolution and counter-revolution across the Middle East, but I have, well, being Lebanese as well, I'm quite interested in how the uprising has unfolded and also the questions of how the opposition can take power in Lebanon in the context of a sectarian power sharing arrangement at the moment. And I'm also involved in a political party in Lebanon, Muwatinun Muwatinat fi Dawla, Citizens in a State Party, which is a progressive opposition party, a nascent party that's trying to establish a civil state. So I'm just going to do two things. I'm going to share a very quick reading of the power sharing arrangement after the war, so 1990s onwards. And then I'm going to zoom in a bit on the current state of affairs and the dilemma of peace building, because it seems like the key thing here is the question of peace. And it seems to me that in the context of what the country is going through now, peace is very much at stake. So first of all, a quick reading. The conflict, I think, in Lebanon did not really end in the implementation of power sharing arrangement in the 1990s. The conflict indeed was transformed and some form of peace was produced, but it did not end. It was transformed because the sectarian parties, the key sectarian parties, were technically given exclusive control over the state, which meant that the conflict itself was imported into the state. This is important. So clearly, I'm not understanding the conflict here as strictly rifles and blood. The conflict is really over how resources are allocated, and by granting them exclusive authority over how resources are allocated, we technically turn the state into the field of competition. Of course, there is a margin of some of the resources that were not assigned. So the power sharing arrangement did not assign all the resources that are controlled by the state. So there was a margin in which they were allowed to fight over in this period. It wasn't predetermined. But broadly speaking, the state was really turned into a cow to be milked, no more, no less. And that was problematic because then it wasn't sustainable. The country was basically, the state affairs was turned into a field in which the resources can be funneled into communities that obviously were decided based on sects. And therefore, most of the resources of the state, instead of being invested in the development of an economy and the formation of a state after the war, instead, the peace that was created, so from a macro perspective, we say it has been a peaceful period, but the peace that was created was specifically because the sectarian actors avoided the formation of a state and avoided the development of an economy. They developed an artificial economy and an artificial middle class, which has just collapsed now as we speak, in return for fortifying the sectarian loyalties in the country, which John very much referred to. It was impressive because it was sustainable for over 20 years, but it did so not because it was actually sustainable. It's a combination of luck and dubious fiscal schemes, which are now being unfolded from the central bank. And also by exporting one thing, which is people like me. So the young, skilled, and educated Lebanese that would be sent out of the country and directly or indirectly so that they can send back some foreign currency, which in turn sustains high levels of consumption and public sector recruitment without any meaningful production of wealth in our economy, as I said. That also tags into some form of slavery sanctioned by the state by bringing a lot of migrant workers that actually do the job on behalf of society. So society was largely bribed, and therefore there was some form of peace. But then, as I said, this has collapsed. So the cow has been milked to death. The state has collapsed. It's a really historical moment for Lebanon now. And this is the dilemma for policymakers, because peace, the way in which it has unfolded, relied heavily on maintaining this clientelist network. Like society really enjoying the bribe of high consumption, low production, and basically having migrant workers doing most of the work. But then if you want to sustain that peace, there has to be a way in which money has to be allocated again for the same channels of clientelism to keep all the sects at bay. State formation does not bring peace at this specific moment because the state has already collapsed and the economy has imploded. But in the meantime, because that's not a good and sustainable measure, the NGOs are buying some time for society. A lot of money has been funneled into the third sector, as they call it, because of the crises. And it has kept things at bay in the meantime as the sects are buying themselves some time to find new donors and aids that can revive their clientelist networks. So the alternative, the real alternative, is obviously the formation of a state, which is no longer there. But on the short term, and this is the dilemma of peace, if society is to make the choice of forming a civil state through this transitional period, then this requires difficult choices of redistributing losses fairly because the economy has collapsed, savings of the people have been wiped out, And then society has to accept the difficult choice of not being bribed anymore, no longer having high levels of consumption, and therefore having to accept massive losses and accept the rule of law, basically, which did not exist under the sectarian system. It was lawlessness that was part of the bribe, technically. This requires being forced on the sectarian parties because, and this is my conclusion, as I said, their own survival relied structurally on clientelism. And therefore, any attempt at reform, which involves formation of the state, inherently means an existential threat to their own survival. So they are structurally incapable of making any reform, which in any way can save society at the moment. So in a comparative way, the only way forward is for opposition to force on the sectarian parties to be part of the transitional period so that they can contribute to the formation of a civil state without really scaring the sectarian parties away. But this requires the opposition to be strong, and that's not the case. Also, it requires international awareness of and a bold decision at the foreign policy level to contribute to the emergence of a civil state instead of buying ourselves more time and funneling money to the sectarian channels. And this brings me at the end to a quote by Antonio Gramsci. The old is dying, right? This has died. The regime is, the relations of power are no longer sustainable, but the new cannot be born. So we are in the period, in the interregnum, as Gramsci says, in which a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. And this is where we are today in Lebanon.
Thank you very much. Not a lot of hope there in your conclusion, but maybe we can discuss some potential solutions after this. I want to turn to Leila Molina Allen, the freelance foreign correspondent in Beirut. Leila.
Hi, everyone. I have unmuted myself, haven't I? Yes. So I'm here, obviously, for a slightly different purpose as a journalist, for sort of modern examples of how this power sharing, or as I very quickly came to discover when I started to cover Lebanon, power division is the way I would describe it, rather than power sharing, has impacted society and what we've seen in the last few years in Lebanon. I am in a slightly different position from many foreign correspondents in Lebanon, because lots of people over the last few years, pretty much since the last sort of big Lebanon news event, which was in 2008, were mostly here to cover Syria, to cover Iraq. And I moved here 5 years ago, and I started working for a French channel, and the French obviously incredibly interested in Lebanon. So unlike many people, I actually became a Lebanon correspondent. And what that gave me the opportunity to do was get really, really engaged at a time when there wasn't a lot of news with what was going on politically and socially in Lebanon. And I learned a lot in those years of doing that coverage that meant that in the last year and a half, a lot of what you've seen in terms of press coverage of Lebanon has very much been to do with the immediate events, but perhaps not as much analysis as there might be of what led up to that and what was happening directly before. You know, these protests didn't come out of nowhere, and neither did everything else that's happened over the last year and a half. So just looking back a bit, certainly in terms of my last 5 years here and how I've seen what happened after Taif play out. Of course, it's pretty interesting that the protests kicked off almost exactly 30 years after Taif was signed. But before that, of course, you know, when I first got here 5 years ago, there was no president. We were in a situation of stasis here. And that was such an example of the way that government wasn't functioning. And you started to see people being very angry about certain social issues, like, of course, the big one was the trash protests, the fact that things weren't working on the streets. From the outside, there was this idea that Lebanon was very happy, was very prosperous, was, you know, this wonderful place in the Middle East where everything was going pretty well after years of political problems. And pretty quickly, it became clear that that wasn't true. And then, of course, in 2018, we had the elections here after 10 years of no elections. And there was so much hope, particularly from the outside, that there was going to be change. You know, suddenly this whole young generation who'd never been able to vote before were going to vote differently. My editors were so excited about the independents who were running. We were going to have a completely different class of politicians. And of course, that's not what happened at all. It was very clear that wasn't going to happen if you actually looked at things like the fact there still had to be political lists. So even if you were running as an independent. If you looked at those lists, you had to be running alongside established figures. They also gerrymandered the boundaries to try and change things so that the actual figures that came out of voting weren't quite what people thought they were going to be. In the end, only 2 independents won. It actually turned out to be 1 because one of their wins was overturned. In Beirut won the most liberal place across Lebanon. And of course, that independent candidate who became an MP wasn't actually able to do anything at the end. And I remember on election day, speaking to young people saying, who did you vote for? And one by one in Beirut, they all said to me, oh, I just went back to the village, voted for who my parents told me to vote for, and then came back down for lunch with my friends. There was no belief among any of these people that this election was going to change anything. And of course it didn't. And that was such an example of the fact that young people here didn't believe that politics was a way forward for them, that the country was not built to help them and wasn't really built in a way that meant all Lebanese could work together. It was built in a way that, you know, there were particular structures that you stuck to, and that was how it worked. And that was what seemed so different when the protests started in late 2019, because suddenly in those first few days, you saw a complete change. You saw people from all different groups, from all different sects, from all different classes coming out together in the streets and protesting, but that only lasted a few days. And almost immediately what started to happen was that you saw different political leaders from the established sectarian groups coming and saying, oh, you must watch out for this, you must watch out for that, they haven't got your back. And one by one, you started to see groups pulling out and people starting to say, and I remember being on the streets those first few days and how the tone changed to all of them means all of them, changed to, yes, but yours has to go first. And immediately that creeping fear came back in. And that creeping fear, of course, comes from the fact that, as both John and Ibrahim were talking about, the way that resources have been divided here is not about sharing. They've been divided up between these established leaders to be used as a way to encourage support, because they're distributed amongst, through clientelism, amongst the people who will back these established leaders. And of course, for young people here, as we've seen with so many people emigrating, if you are a young person who has free thought and who has the skills and ability to be able to make something different of your life, why wouldn't you choose to go and do it somewhere else? And that's what's so difficult here, and what we saw again when people started to say, well, where is the opposition? What do these protests mean? The fact is, there isn't an opposition, firstly, because of the way that the political system works is such that you have to have the connections. The whole country is built on this idea that there must be wasta, of course, connections, and that everybody has them so everybody can have a piece of the pie. But if you don't, the kind of people who many people would say should be in politics can't get into it, which is why we see so much generational politics with these politicians. There's always somewhere to move on to. So there aren't really options. There wasn't really a way for a proper political opposition movement to be built within the existing political structure. And then you saw so much misinformation flying around as well. One of the most interesting things to me in those protests was to see these camps being set up to educate young people on how their political system actually works, on what's really in Lebanon's constitution, what people think of as the constitution, and elements of the constitution that aren't actually, for instance, the National Pact, which was never actually written out. People starting to understand that these sectarian divisions that they had always been told were completely enshrined in the way the country runs, and that's the only way that Parliament's allowed to run, were only meant to be temporary. And suddenly you started to see these completely new ideas coming out, with people starting to understand that the country wasn't necessarily what they thought it had been. So even though the protests did eventually founder, and perhaps those protesters didn't get what they wanted, I do see a change in how, when you speak to young people, their political understanding of what's possible here, and that what they grew up believing is not necessarily how things have to be. And I really think you saw that after the explosion as well, the way that the groups that were set up in order to make the protests continue working and to spread the word across the country and work together started being used for other things. You saw essentially, a Ministry of Public Works being started by 20-year-olds standing up and going through houses, helping people to fix their houses, helping people to figure out what was needed because they felt the government wouldn't do that. So there has been some sort of change as a result of the political movement we've seen over the last 2 years. But the question is now whether, firstly, the Parliament and the government, the way such as it exists, is actually going to be willing to make any change. Because as Ibrahim said right there, what's their motivation? Any kind of reform is going to remove them from power. And secondly, there's really important character, of course, of international actors, what their role is and what they should be doing, who they should be working with, because as they did during the Civil War, as they did in TAF, as they did afterwards, they play such an important role in where the power goes and who is able to make real change here. Now, I've gone on and on, so I'm going to leave it there, but that's just a few of the things that I've seen over the last few years that I think really are results of the way that power sharing or power division works in Lebanon.
Thank you, Layla. That was really interesting and raised some very good questions there. And on that, just remember, please put any questions that you may have in the Q&A box, write them out, and we'll go to questions after this. But first of all, I'm going to turn now to Sami Atala, former director at the Lebanese Center for Policy Studies. Sami.
Very good. Thank you, Anna, and thank you for this kind of invitation. The question that I'm going to try to answer is the following. I mean, does power sharing actually lead to stability? That was one of the questions that I was brainstorming with Adam on, and I thought about this, and I was like, what do we really mean by stability here, right? Because this whole notion, as John said earlier on, that countries or where they have multi-confessional or multi-ethnic power sharing is a way out, a way to preserve the system, is a way to protect people who feel they're excluded from the system. So when I'm thinking of stability, and if I translate stability to absence of violence, then I would probably argue that in the last 30 years, the power sharing arrangement did avoid violence, in fact. Now, if we actually say no, stability, we mean by stability is prosperity, whereby we're going to end up with development or growth, then I would argue that the power sharing arrangement, in fact, not only failed to create jobs or improve people's standard of living, in fact, now it's actually just destroyed that as a result of the power sharing arrangement. So it depends on which one we want to take. So let me start maybe just elaborating a little bit more on how they were able to sort of maintain the system and how did they do it. So if you think of these political leaders and political communities and heading these communities, in fact, they managed to maintain, enlarge this coalition. And we saw that in 2005 after Prime Minister Hariri's assassination, where the other Christian blocs that were actually in exile or in prison brought back to the fold to precisely maintain that stability that was actually shaken after the assassination of Hariri and the withdrawal of the Syrian regime. But then we also saw after that there's a lot of collusion. Here we don't call it collusion, we call it national unity government. It's a much nicer terminology here, but in fact it's a collusion by the political parties to actually run the country. And what's really interesting about this is like almost a club, and anyone who actually threatens or challenges this group will be actually faced with either violence in case if there were armed groups. And we saw that in Tripoli, in Saida, 4 or 5 years ago, Sheikh al-Asir in Saida, who challenged the political and the Sunni establishment per se. He was tolerated for a certain time and for political ends, but then there was a sort of a decision to remove any challenge to the Sunni establishment. Now, and it works in other instances. But then we also saw when we have secular groups actually challenging the establishment. And here I'm thinking of the labor unions in the 90s. I'm thinking of the teachers' movement in the 2013, 2014, when we saw civil society, Beirut Madinati in the municipal election of 2016. We saw that in the parliamentary elections that my other panelists mentioned in 2018. You see how the establishment reacts by forming a united front and united lists. Suddenly all the problems get resolved and they're actually very ready to challenge these secular groups through elections. And we also saw that by supporting each other. And I think the most dramatic one was after the October 17 revolution, Sayyid Nasrallah comes to rescue Hariri, the prime minister who was actually heading the government there. So that sort of play of power sharing, where they've been able to collude together, has worked very well for them. And this has been actually helped by the distribution of rents. I think we often don't talk a lot about that, a political economy analysis of this problem, because we tend to think of power sharing as a group of people who are heading their communities or representing their communities with all the problems of representation that John mentioned. And there's this whole way of rent that's being distributed, and I'm going to come back to that because that has been part of the destruction that we are facing currently. But the system works in such a way that they've actually invented new gimmicks. In addition to the power sharing arrangement that was in Ta'if, then they went to Doha in Qatar for another sort of arrangement. Then we started coming up, or political elite started coming up with new mechanisms of ruling. For instance, we started hearing about veto power. Now there were other talks about the king minister, and then we have, the prime minister's club select who's going to be the next prime minister, as was just recently happened. These are all tools, or I call them political gimmicks, used to salvage and maintain the system when actually it hits a wall. Now, it's all not rosy, right? Because this collusion often has led to paralysis, right? As a result of political, ideological, or decrease of rent. And we saw that between 2006 to 2016, where the country was totally paralyzed. But what I find interesting that even during this period of time, and despite all the animosity and between the two camps, what was called back then the March 8 and the March 14, is that they didn't resort to violence. Now, that element, I describe the system as if it's a pendulum that goes from collusion all the way to paralysis and back to collusion. And if you cannot collude, then the whole country is paralyzed, as we are currently right now. We're in paralysis. We had it a few years ago with the presidential election and what have you. Now, that is obviously a key and a major problem. Now, what we see is that how is it sustained? How is that system sustained? And I think while they have maintained that stability or pseudo-stability, they have actually managed to undermine all state institutions that deal with what I call horizontal accountability and vertical accountability. And what I mean by horizontal accountability, this collusion, they have made the judiciary obviously very dependent on them. They have understaffed, undermined oversight agencies. They have, in fact, the parliament just became a club, frankly, that actually doesn't hold or rarely holds, or when it holds oversight sessions, is theatrical. And we did a study at LCPS that I co-led with colleagues of mine, and we actually really looked at even if the MPs know the concerns of their citizens, and not only constituency at large and their own from their same community, and they couldn't even tell us exactly when we matched what people said and what the MPs said. When we looked at the laws that they passed, only 9 or 10% actually dealt with people's concerns. When we actually asked them about what's unemployment rate, they couldn't even tell us what unemployment rate is. Shocking. Poverty rate, forget it. Only 25% managed to get it right after we gave them a large margin in terms of getting the answer right. And we asked them about policy coherence. Guess what? Political members of the political party from the same political parties don't know what their party's position is. And parties from the same sect and same confession did not agree with each other. So removing the whole notion of what does it really mean to be leading your community or representing your community if you actually can't even agree with your other MP or know the concerns of your constituency. So that sort of unpacks the whole and the more complex problem that we have at hand. But also there's the vertical accountability problem. And what I mean by that is that the relationship between the MPs and the politicians essentially and their voters. And here what I refer to in Lebanon is actually the elections is a moment when politicians select their voters versus voters electing their representatives, just because from the electoral law, from the districting, from the way the discourse of their speeches, which we also did a nice study recently on unpacking the discourse, which evokes emotions, all the way to vote buying. All of that has actually removed any sense of accountability from the citizen to the political elite. Now, why is this? And I'm going to wrap it up very quickly here. Just to sort of go back to my first question, is it does power sharing lead to stability? And now I want to look at the stability where it's about development. Well, guess what? There will be no development, no growth. You know what I mean? If there's no accountability, just because politicians will not provide anything to citizens in the sense of the larger public good, if they're not being held accountable. And by undermining all these accountability mechanisms, now we're actually at a stage where, in fact, they have corruption is very high. We have probably the largest Ponzi scheme in the history of the world in terms of what just happened with the depositors. We've got politically connected firms. We looked at all the contracts that the state planning ministry, which is called the CDR, has contracted. A huge portion are going to politically connected firms. All of that, siphoning the system and extracting the system and its resources, we reached to an end where now the system has imploded and they can't even reform it because of their entrenched interest. So here, power sharing to me is a very serious problem if it comes to in terms of its impact on development. And I'll stop here and have more time for discussion. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Again, some really, really important issues raised. And I think the common thread running through everything that the four of you have talked about are these huge challenges of how to build peace and prosperity from now into the future, where you have what do we mean by stability, where you have a democracy that is corrupt, essentially. So I'm going to turn to some questions. Just have a look here. I mean, from my point of view, I'm quite interested and coming to this issue relatively recently to really focus on this, although I've been aware of obviously of these issues over the past years and the crises and the developments in Lebanon. But the Beirut blast last August, seemed to bring everything to a head. And now that during COVID as well, during trying to address this health crisis, with a blast on the port that was essentially the whole infrastructure for access, for aid, for delivery being wiped out. So including crucial grain silos, which housed, I think, 85% of the country's grain resources, and a medical supply warehouse. And we know that reports, and you'll be able to tell me if this is accurate, but reports that at the moment the health infrastructure in Lebanon is collapsing, completely collapsing. So it was already on the brink of collapse without sustained international action. And the blast, COVID, has just heaped more of that on top. So where do we go from here? Where are the elements, the glimmers of hope, perhaps for the people of Lebanon? Because I think it was Layla that mentioned that shortly after the blast, you saw people getting out and about on the streets to help in a way that was unprecedented, creating their own networks, creating their own supply chains to help people affected in the blast. Is there some hope we can take from that in terms of a resurgence of an opposition? Shall I go to Layla first?
Now, I absolutely did raise that as a hopeful point, and I do think that's the only hopeful point, is the incredible way in which people reacted after the explosion. My own house exploded. I was badly injured and I couldn't walk, and the entire community, the same thing happened to everyone, and every single person who could walk, everyone, I remember in the hours afterwards, we were all just sitting in the streets doing first aid on each other. Everyone who could walk was going around trying to help people, and nothing from the government at all. And it was incredible to see, and I remember tears in people's eyes. The day afterwards was just shock, and the day after that, the armies came out, 18-year-old kids armed with their brooms. People were coming back to their houses from the hospital, with their injured family members, people who are crying in hospitals as I was interviewing them, saying, we have nothing to go back to. I don't know what to do. I have a disabled husband now, and we can't, going home and finding their entire home swept up, their damaged items carefully, lovingly placed on the shelves around. Now that's incredible, but that's not a government. And one of the problems here is that the Lebanese people are so capable, they are so able, and they have had decades in which to do more of that because they haven't been provided any services by their government. So they're used to doing it themselves. This is why this political system has been able to survive like this for so long, because people don't expect what they should from their government. And just to put it in context, before the explosion, everybody suddenly paid attention to Beirut because of the explosion. But in the months before, we were desperately saying to our editors, people are starving on the streets. People were starting to rob shops, crying as they held guns, saying, I'm sorry, but I can't feed my children. In the 2 weeks before the explosion, we had no power in all of Beirut, and often they don't have power across the country, and that's again getting even worse now. So those issues are so desperate. That huge medical supply warehouse was destroyed, but now they haven't been able to re-import because of the import conditions here. And just on that grain silo point, everyone panicked when the grain silo exploded. And then we found out that because the politician who's in charge of buying the grain hadn't got around to doing it, the country hadn't actually lost as much of its grain supply as it thought it had, because he hadn't bothered to buy it, because he'd spent the money on something else. The money had been siphoned off. So it gets worse and worse every level you go down. One of the things with the port exploding was us discovering just how bad the corruption had been at the port, how much money was lost. And then, of course, when I started reporting on the aid coming into the country, the aid starts coming in and everyone's saying, don't give it to the politician and don't let the government have anything to do with it. But because of the way that the airport and the port are divided up, anything that comes into the country is going to be operated by people who've been given their jobs by political figures who distribute those jobs based on a favoritist basis. So there's no way to stop the bleeding. So, and I'm sorry to be the voice of doom here, and I hope that somebody else will say something more hopeful, but the fact that there are incredibly brave and strong and loyal people here desperately working to help each other is not a solution. And as long as people here, the way they say it is the government, they're all initially, previously they were all fighting each other, all these parties for power, and now they're together against us, hiding in the Parliament building while we struggle to survive. So I don't think, without political change, that there is hope here.
Thank you. And I'm just going to somebody else. I think I'll bring in another question as well here. A couple of people have put in the Q&A box here that, we saw in the aftermath of the explosion, we saw the international community take note, as you mentioned, Layla, and we saw Macron arrive in great pomp and circumstance. We saw countries across the world speak out about what should be done. Very active, but efforts seem to have fizzled out. So what role does France currently have? And also, what role could the UK government have as well in seeing some leadership? And of course, the entire rest of the international community in terms of rebuilding peace and an alternative within Lebanon. Shall I go to Ibrahim?
So basically, I want to turn the cynicism around, right? This is probably what we need at this moment. Solidarity is a great thing, and the Lebanese, as Layla mentioned, are quite veterans in this because of getting used to the fact that the state cannot deliver specifically in context of a crisis. So now we have to turn this solidarity and this agency that specifically the young people is experiencing into political practice, right? Because we've mentioned that the way forward is political change, which requires also a belief that it is possible. There's the cynicism vibe is also something that the sectarian parties try to project, that there's no way around it, you're sectarian by nature, that there's no way, this is the only source of survival and prosperity, etc., etc. So what's happening now, and this is the hopeful side, is that hundreds of people, at least in my party, have joined my party, and thousands other are trying to come up with new political organizations. But this is a nascent project. My party is a bit more mature, like 4 or 5 years, but others, they have just emerged out of the moment of the uprising, which broke this cynicism and gave them a sense of the agency. But the problem is, and this is the role of France and the UK here, thinking about that, pondering that. Historically, specifically France, I mean, the interventions that France has done are very limited to containing any crisis and passing the bucket to the next government. This is probably the inherent dilemma of democracies in the West, that despite the fact that they come in and support and help, now they're supporting civil society, etc., but that does not really lead to political and long-term transformation. And therefore, we're just trying to buy ourselves more time. Instead, there has to be a serious and bold and proactive initiative to engage with even nascent opposition, to contribute to the maturity of an alternative, of a tangible, viable alternative that can produce negotiated transition. So I don't think if we're really careful about peace among sects, there has to be a negotiated transition, a new political pact, as John mentioned, that would involve the building a state with the opposition, because otherwise the sects themselves, they won't take that initiative. That requires a bold choice, a foreign policy choice, but otherwise I think it's very likely that we will continue to try to organize, we'll continue to try to become meaningful actors, but without a bold and proactive initiative by countries that usually play a huge part in the way in which the power sharing arrangement is reproduced, we are stuck in a loop.
Thank you. Can I bring somebody else in just to respond to that, and also we've got a really just to add to that, and I think all the questions coming in are of the same same sort of ilk. But one from Louise, which says, if you could design the perfect system to establish peace in Lebanon, eliminate corruption and support people, if you were in charge, what would you do?
Me?
Anybody who'd like to come in. Ibrahim, go quickly, and then we'll go to somebody else.
The formation of a civil state, not a secular state, a civil state, in which people, regardless if they believe in sects, or they think this is their primary identity or not, they have access to resources unconditional upon their loyalties to sects, therefore completely wiping out that existential feel that every sect feels, while at the same time ensuring that they have the right to practice politics based on their sects. This is the moment for it, because we are already de facto in a transition. The economy has imploded, and therefore the sects are weak. We need to be proactive to be part of this negotiated transition into the formation of a civil state.
Okay, there's the solution. I'm not sure it's as easy as just that, but it sounds good. I don't know, Sami, did you want to come in there?
Yeah, thank you. Well, let me sort of take a stab at this. There's sort of two questions. What should international community do, and the ideal state? I obviously can't answer any of those in the sense of the ideal scenario. But let me just say, on the ideal system, look, there are just two fundamental issues for me. Is representation and accountability. We need to sort these two out. The representation, we need to sort of go back and question this whole notion that political parties or politicians representing their sects. As I shared with you earlier on the MPs from different sects, and the fact that they don't really carry any weight in the sense of knowing or not knowing people's preferences and what have you, shows how disturbing this whole system is. That in fact the 128 MPs, that in fact we have 5 or 6 major MPs who rule the country, and not even in parliament. When we looked at their participation in the discussion and the deliberation in parliament, or their attendance, by the way, those guys don't even show up to parliament. That tells you all the action takes place somewhere else in terms of forming policies and what have you that they agree upon. So this issue of representation and this confessional way of doing it needs to be seriously revised, and one can think of ways to do that, because because there are some people who believe that people from their own communities will protect them. I believe it's a myth, it's exaggerated, but I think we need to still address it. We cannot dismiss it. And just one little anecdote: one time when I was working on a decentralization law, part of a committee, and I was presenting it in a sort of with an audience, and somebody comes up to me and she said to me, "I really don't like the law because you should have split up Beirut between different sects." She had this notion that if the governor or the mayor is from the same sect, that she will have better services. And I was very provoked by that. So I went and I had collected data on municipalities, and I showed how, with my team, how mayors when the municipality is homogeneous, in the sense that the people and the mayors are from the same sect, tend not to perform better from when actually it's a mixed one. So again, to show that it's not about only just being ruled by your own people. If you don't hold them accountable, that even the people from your own sect will not give you these services. So hence my second point about accountability. I think a system that has no accountability will become corrupt, and is corrupt in Lebanon. And you take the West, you take any Western political system, if there's no accountability, forget it, So to me, I will have to enshrine those two major concepts in different institutions to ensure that we actually produce better results for the people. In terms of getting, sorry, I'm taking longer than I thought. In terms of international community and so forth, that's really, really, really a difficult one. And maybe I could summarize it to the following. What I'd like to see is that whether the governments or the judiciary help bring the money that was stolen back home. And what we just saw with Switzerland happening, where we saw an MP from Switzerland actually right now filing a case through the prosecutor in Switzerland, or the prosecutor, in fact, Switzerland, against the central bank governor in Lebanon for transferring $400 million. Shocking, right? 400 million. And you know what the Lebanese media is talking about now? Who leaked that information instead of holding, a public servant who just transferred 400 million, and no one dared to ask, where did he get that money from? How could the central bank governor have so much money, right? So that the international community could actually come in and just help us collect all the money that was stolen and hold those people accountable, because unfortunately the judiciary system here in Lebanon is not independent and is unable to actually do so. I'll stop here. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know if John wants to come in on either of those two issues.
Yeah, hiya. Yeah, it's definitely not my place to come up with silver bullet solutions for Lebanon. If you don't mind, I can just roll back to your question about the role of international actors, especially France and the UK. I think it's pretty clear that international actors have not been benign when it comes to Lebanon. I think on the whole, we've had very kind of simplistic kind of understandings of Lebanon. It's just this place divided by competing sectarian identities. And in fact, in the conversations I've had with reasonably kind of high level actors, UK development and so on, they said that what we're in Lebanon for is to make sure that, the refugee issue doesn't have kind of blowback for Europe, for the UK and the rest of it. That's all they really kind of care about. So as long as they have kind of peace and stability, non-violence, we're not willing to use their officers in any way which kind of promotes kind of peace and actually do things which are counterintuitive. So, a good example of this is, the UK government has put lots of money into the Lebanese armed forces, for example, because, it's seen as helping with a fight against, insurgents from Syria and the rest of it. But they've never used this money in a way to promote leverage in terms of how some of these security institutions carry out human rights abuses against LGBTQ people, for example. So, yeah, I mean, the international community is only interested in Lebanon, in terms of Lebanon not turning into Syria, or the refugee issue, blowing back and having an impact on us over here. So I think the big question is for you, people like you, Anna, what you can do to, to promote a more sort of progressive, policy towards Lebanon, rather than just maintaining, the sectarian elites at all costs, because they're seen as the bastions of peace and security. So anyway, yeah, hopefully I didn't put you on the spot there, Anna, but yeah, maybe that's a question you can think about.
Yeah, thank you. And I don't mind being put on the spot at all, but I think you raised some important points in terms of how the international community need to, what they can do to bring about change, but in their support, either through funding, but also, and this links back to another question actually, through the Lebanese community that aren't in Lebanon. I mean, other than in terms of asking for funding or to reach into their pockets for aid, is there a role for the diaspora around the world to influence some kind of radical change and reform? I don't know who has a particular thought on that, but perhaps John, because you're, or Ibrahim. John, go for it.
Obviously, I'm not from the Lebanese diaspora here in Belfast. Nevertheless, yeah, I mean, of course, kind of diasporas, we know from kind of research that diasporas can be really important in terms of kind of peace building support. It's not just about kind of funding, it's using that kind of leverage and power and so on. But I think kind of Ibrahim made like a really important point earlier. It's not about the diaspora, it's about making sure that the next kind of generation of kind of human capital, I know that's a terrible kind of word to use, but kind of young people don't have to leave Lebanon, go off and work in different places and so on. The question is, how can Lebanon hold on to, exciting, really valuable, important young people who have so much to contribute? And I think, that's probably one of the major kind of issues going forward.
I mean, I think we saw a lot of this in the reaction to the blast. Traditionally, the Lebanese diaspora has always contributed hugely to the country, both in terms of the fact that they come back every summer and every winter. We've actually seen a big coronavirus spike here because the government wanted to keep the airport open so the diaspora would come back at Christmas and spend money and boost the economy here. But also they were quite practically helping after the explosion, by people were traveling home with suitcases of medicine to help and taking them to, the handout places on the street and that sort of thing. The problem is that so many people in the diaspora now feel that they're not willing to contribute. They were starting to say things like, no, we're not going to contribute anymore to a country where the government is going to be in charge of where this money goes, right? And the only other way you can do it is contributing privately to your family, which doesn't necessarily help the wider country. And the issue isn't necessarily Lebanese young people leaving. Traditionally, it's great that Lebanese young people have left. They have got an education in fantastic institutions around the world. They speak so many languages. They get so much experience. The issue is wanting them to come back, right? And feed that back into the country, rather than feeling that Lebanon is just a place of their childhood dreams that has beautiful beaches and beautiful mountains, but there's no hope for them there. Because this is what I hear from every young person I speak to and from every parent, that this is only a place for childhood and retirement, where there's no opportunity here. There's nothing else you can do. And the second that you need to have any practical opportunity in your life, you need to be somewhere else. I think the issue that Ibrahim and actually Sami and John both raised parts of this as well, is that the issue, it's not really about sectarianism here anymore, and talking about it that way frames it incorrectly. It's about the fact that the way that things have progressed is such that the survival of sectarian difference here has become more important than the individual. And what needs to change is that it needs to become about, when everyone says, oh, I'm Lebanese first, it's not about patriotism. It's about the rights of an individual as a Lebanese person need to come before which sect they're a part of, which religion they're a part of. Because otherwise you get the situation where anyone who's vulnerable, as we've just been talking about, be it a minority community, if you're LGBT, if you're a woman, if you're elderly, unless you are willing to ascribe to what's necessary to be supported by whatever sectarian local leader is the person who's doling out the favors and doling out the support. Nobody else is going to help you. And potentially I just want to say one positive thing that could be looked at, and this is a way that international partners could help if they try and focus on things like this, is slightly outside the political system. One thing Lebanon is amazing at is their local institutions, setting up their not-profit institutions, very, very small scale. And there are a lot of people I've met with who are doing incredible things in this country, trying to essentially run services, but for everyone, that aren't being run by the government. And if you look at, for instance, there's one woman that I speak to a lot who started a local charity for old people, just to provide them with food and basic rent, because often they can't survive because there's no pension system here, proper pension system here, unless you work for the government. They've now gone beyond that. And they're now, one of the big issues in Lebanon is the fact that, as we've talked about, there's no proper economy because it's all been built on this house of cards and there's no actual practical industry here. But Lebanon has great agricultural land, right? So if you go back before the Syrian subsidies were an issue, Lebanon used to grow a lot of its own things. This organization now has started teaching young people how to do proper biodynamic farming so they can bring back large-scale agriculture to Lebanon that isn't controlled by foreign imported seeds. They're then using that to feed all these elderly people, and they've now bridged out further. Now, people like that are the kind of people who, if foreign institutions, foreign governments work with them, not seeing them as a charity, but potentially a political figure. That is somebody who could then stand up and say, I've been running this program for 5 years. I know the local communities. I know how to create prosperity. People trust me. I'm not being selected because I'm going to do what the big political leaders tell me, which is always the issue, right? Now they're saying they want people who are bureaucrats who know things, but they're basically picking university professors, right? A technocratic government. They're not picking people with actual lived experience. If you try and reach out to people like that and work with those institutions, they're potentially leaders of the future who are practically doing things rather than sitting in rooms having conversations about the future of the constitution. So that's another different way of looking at it that's potentially quite positive.
Yeah, I think that throws up some really interesting solutions, but also challenges from the international community and international governments and representatives in how to engage with Lebanon. And we're sitting in the UK, and you're not, but I'm sitting here in the UK with a UK government who has just made huge cuts in the aid budget. We don't know yet where they're going to come from, but they're going to put huge pressure on the current aid that goes there. Now, that will all go through official channels. So what you're suggesting sounds fantastic, but in practice, I'm not sure how that certainly from the UK and from some of the big countries and from the UN, because a lot of aid is distributed through the UN and support, much more difficult, but something that's worth perhaps discussing as well at those levels. I'm just looking at some of the questions coming in. And there's a question here. If the growth of civil society is critical, which Ibrahim, you mentioned in one of your answers, and there are many more critical actors emerging, is there a need for them to work better together and maybe a risk of their efforts being too dispersed? If not, and is there a way, I'm just adding to this question, but is there a way that can be done? And then there's a follow-up question from somebody else, which is, are young people in Lebanon more likely to, or less likely to support a less sectarian future?
Okay, so the nascent political parties have tried very hard, specifically in the moment of the uprising in 2019, to create a political alliance that represents the alternative, and therefore put much more pressure on sectarian status quo, because it kind of co-opts the streets. It suggests that there's this popular mandate to take over and dictate the rules of the transition. But this unfortunately did not come to fruition for many reasons. One, most of these parties are still not ready to pursue power. So they are young. Their reading of the situation and also their narrative, their ideas, even their organizational capacities are not yet at a level where they can present themselves as a mature and credible alternative to really veteran political parties like the sectarian parties. And secondly, there's a disagreement on the way forward, which we've just kind of accentuated. Many new political groups would be satisfied in going for an electoral fight, which probably what would the outcome would be reproducing the legitimacy. We've just, I think Layla and John mentioned this, and Sami mentioned elections, but reproducing the legitimacy of sectarian parties in the elections, because as Sami said, they select the voters. And instead, the opposition would get like 2 or 3 seats in a facade of a democracy. Like, it's not real. So they kind of, you perform parliamentary politics without really any meaningful change. So some political parties are still today aiming for that, despite the fact that there's an existential crisis, while other parties do not want to play the electoral game. They know that this is kind of the rules are dictated by sectarian parties, and it won't be really a meaningful transition of power. So these things are really the block that's making it harder for these opposition parties to come together. And specifically because they don't have this sort of regional international support that can mediate between them, therefore it becomes harder to find common grounds and compromises. The second point on young people, yes, young people are more likely to be receptive to moving beyond sects because of our organic experience in urban spaces, which kind of demystify the ideas of others in society. Like, I was raised in a Christian school in Beirut, and my class was everything but Christian, right? It's a very cosmopolitan experience for us. That created a completely different generation than the Civil War generation. However, and that's the key point, how can we move from imagining an alternative into actually acting upon an alternative? And I'd like to disagree with Layla on this point. There's no alternative to the state, no matter how much we fund and aid and support NGOs. If the state is not formed, we're simply buying ourselves some time and saving some lives. But on the long term, the state has to be formed, and therefore only the state can develop an economy.
Just to be clear, I very much wasn't saying the state isn't incredibly important. I just meant this as an additional option as well to try and boost, people kind of outside Beirut who are trying to do development projects as well.
And just from a reflection on the discussion just earlier on the diaspora, it is possibly up to politicians and spokespeople in the international community within that to encourage that return, to rebuild that state. So that's kind of what I'm getting from you in this discussion. Okay, let's just.
Can I come in here?
Yeah, of course.
Just reflecting on the diaspora as well on elections and so forth. Indeed, I mean, as Brahim said and others as well, that elections are unlikely to produce change. And we saw this in 2018 election, as Layla very well stated as well. Despite all the problems we had between 2009 and 2018, we really hoped that we'll have a breakthrough somehow, somewhere. And obviously it did not materialize, And I think this whole aspect of the psychology of the voter that needs to really be taken into account. I fear sometimes that we think that we need to get civil society, be organized better, more, have a program, all the modern tools of actually winning elections. And I don't think these things work, actually. So what I really think we need to take into account is how people vote. And people here, those who don't like the political establishment, at best, or some of them at least, will stay at home and not vote for an alternative. Because there's a fear of voting against these people, because the way the society works, the linkages, whether about your work, businesses, employment, getting services, it's very much entrenched. It's not about vote buying on that day that, only. It's about, this whole clientelistic relationship that is very much in place. Now, the question is, has this changed or is this broken? Could it be because after the Beirut explosion, people's deposits have disappeared or evaporated? You know, could that still make the change? And we also obviously hope that it does. I mean, if half of the city got destroyed and people still for these people, then, you know, but hey, let's not kid ourselves. You know, they might still vote for them. You know, so that's why I feel like that we need to do and understand better. And I think diaspora could help here as well, because helping people, because people count on these politicians. And now with the reduction of the rents and availability of these resources, could we find an alternative way to help people to become more and more detached from the politician, from finding a job, from getting schooling, from getting health and what have you. And try to undo that system. And it might work, you know what I mean? And let's kid ourselves, no one really knows how to do these reforms in the country. You know, we all are sort of, you know, trying, and I think we should. So back to the election, I wouldn't put all my eggs on that. I think a break from that through a transitional government, as Brahim very well said, that is definitely a better way to do that. And this is where international community could come in. Instead of Macron coming and bringing the whole shebang or the gangs back into power, you know what I mean, with an agreement, I would say, no, we need to have a clean slate. We need to have a 6-month. And by the way, we looked at historically for Lebanon between 1944 to 1990, we had 7 governments with legislative power that was able to take, you know, to actually undertake major reforms. And in fact, one of these governments gave women the right to vote. You know what I mean? So major reforms happened through actually such governments for 6 months. It ranged from, by the way, 2 months to 9 months, you know, but on average, there were 6 months to do key reforms, independence of the judiciary, electoral law, and other ones, women's right to give citizenship, for example, you know, and the key capital control, for example, to kickstart the whole, not only economy, and I said the society at large. And that's why I think women should be very much, and women's rights should be very much part of that, because of the sacrifices they made for so many years, and in fact playing a key role in all the transformations happening. Now, obviously the big question, could they do that? Will they concede power? You know, no, they won't concede power, but we can always push, whether the international community or the civil society or the citizenship, trying to keep on that pressure, because honestly, that's the only way to go out of that mess we're in. Over to you. Thank you.
Anna, just on that, you asked earlier, you said, you know, France seemed to be coming in and helping, and then that sort of fizzled out a little bit. The key turning point there was initially when Macron first came, everyone was out in the streets saying, you know, he's been more of a leader to us in 15 minutes than any of our leaders have been. Where have they been? And then when he came back, rather than doing what everybody was asking him to do, which was to sideline the politicians, he instead, people started saying he's holding hands with the devil, because he turned around and he said, I need you to nominate, as soon as Hassan Diab resigned, he said, I need you to nominate a new prime minister, and I need you to get a new cabinet in really fast. And that's what he was pushing on. And everyone was saying that that's not going to help. Just another cabinet nominated by the same people, now it's going to be Hariri again. Just another election under the same circumstances is not what's needed here, just as Sami was just saying. So that's where people feel that went wrong. Yeah,
that's a really good point you make. And just on that, and Sami, from what you're saying, and you talk about accountability, you know, what accountability, if the political elite is controlling all aspects, which it is, of government, of the judiciary, associated organizations, how do you see this happening? How do you see an international engagement outside of that to bring about that reform? Does it happen through the UN, for example? Are there steps that we can be pushing for within the international community to make something happen?
And this is a very tough one to answer, and I'm not going to pretend I know the answer to that. But the way conceptually, at least the way I think about that, is that we need to increase the cost on the politicians. We need to increase the cost on the judges who have corruption cases in their drawers, and they're not doing anything about them. We need to, that's the kind of pressure we need to exert to change the calculus. And you know, we saw that, by the way, we saw some of these changes, by the way. It's not all so gloomy in the sense that we saw resignation, we saw 2 government resignations, for example. We saw cases like the judge at one point had to sort of deal with certain issues. You know, yes, sometimes it gets fizzled out, you know, but I think, for example, now after the central bank governor case, I mean, this is, I think, what the pressure should be, you know. Now what in Lebanon, they started, you know, the political establishment criticizing the judiciary in Switzerland. I mean, this is how ridiculous it gets, you know. So increasing that cost, whether from the international community or from the citizens and the civil society, to me, that's going to be fundamental. And obviously, I'd love more of the change coming from local forces rather than from outside. But if the outside, and as the questions have been, how can they help? They can increase the cost of mismanaging and of governing on these political elites, you know, I mean, highly and really open cases, because we don't have that independence. And while the local domestic factors, I think we need to keep on the pressure. Now, things don't help with Corona. We don't help with people's money and, you know, evaporating. They don't have jobs. You know, it's a really tough one. And I can't claim that I know or suggest how it should be, but I really think reforms or changes, you know, they're going to be hard earned. You know what I mean? They're not going to be a picnic. They're not going to be all through protest only. They're going to be through mobilization. You know, even on the elections, as I was saying earlier, you know, we need to even organize at a very, very local level and have electoral machinery very active, because that's how elections are won here. They're not won because you have a program, because you're going to do unemployment, solve unemployment, or what have you. No, you're going to have to be very active on that day or that weekend of elections. So there's a lot of work to be done. Anyway, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to bring in a couple of points that have been made in the Q&A box, particularly in terms of the sectarianism and the role of Hezbollah in Lebanon's future as one of the sects that we've been talking about, and how would civil society, new opposition parties be able to oppose organizations like Hezbollah if they continue in reality to control what's on the ground? How can the international community or civil society help bring about those reforms? I'm conscious, well, who would like to come in to answer that? John.
Thanks.
Sorry.
I'm not a Hezbollah researcher, so I don't really have too much to kind of add on what the international community. I think perhaps the international community is sometimes overly kind of focused on Hezbollah and its sort of relationship with Iran. But yeah, I'm more than happy for somebody else to come in who has a lot more kind of insight towards kind of Hezbollah's kind of role within the Lebanese state.
And I've done a lot of Hezbollah reporting, so if you want me to do a little,
yeah, go for it.
On that, I mean, now, you know, this is not the most popular. Often, what you say here, Hezbollah is one of the most controversial things here, and of course, one of the leftovers from Taif that people feel created so many more problems is the fact that they were allowed to keep their weapons as a deterrent to Israel. And many people feel that since 2006, you know, that should have been changed. The reality here, which is quite uncomfortable for many Western governments to hear, is that Hezbollah is, for many people, not the problem internally that Western governments want it to be, because they are against what it's doing in the region. That's not the same thing as what it's doing in Lebanon. And, you know, to converge those two is exactly what John was talking about earlier, where the interests are not really, you know, what people are doing in Lebanon are not really in favor of the Lebanese. So they really need to be separated out, and we need to be realistic about this. The reality is Hezbollah is incredibly effective, both as a political party and as a social party. Now, we've been talking about how one of the problems that the sects have been able, sectarian leaders have created the situation where they provide social services for the people who support them. But the reality is that Hezbollah has done that far better than many of the other groups. right? They really have successfully created a social infrastructure in which they have created support for people who really do believe that they're helping them and that they're there for them. Historically, the Shia were deeply disenfranchised in Lebanon. If you look at the south of Lebanon, Iran's money there has built so much that wasn't there before, and that they felt people in the north and the center of the country were never going to do for them. You go down there and you speak to Christians and Druze who live in the south, and they will say, and I remember a few years ago as well on the board with Syria as well, Christians saying to me, well, it's not my party, but they're doing more for me than the government in Beirut is, than Christian leaders in Beirut are. So going at this with Hezbollah being the bogeyman is not the correct attitude. Looking at actually what it is that makes people support them. Yes, of course, there is a certain amount, as with any political party like this, a certain amount of brainwashing, a certain amount of the way you're raised and what you're taught in school, but there is also the practicality of what people feel that this institution has done for their lives when there isn't much else to support them. So looking at that and thinking about, right, how do we try and work with these people who have shown that they are willing to work and be in politics? You know, they have spent the last few years really trying to be a functioning political party, really trying to show that they're willing to work with other parties to maintain peace in Lebanon. So perhaps a little bit of backing away from trying to stamp down the boot that they are just a militia, they are just terrorists because of what they're doing elsewhere that Western governments might not like, and trying to actually treat them with respect as a partner. And just going back to something earlier, you know, there is this concern about the money being sent towards the Lebanese armed forces when they've got some pretty egregious human rights contraventions they've been doing over the last year. I've been at protests where I've watched them beat young people, and I've spoken to people at the British Embassy here about the fact that that money is still going to them. Now, I'm not drawing a direct comparison, but you see what I mean, that many people feel here that with international actors, there's, you know, not really equivalence in terms of how those attitudes are playing out. So maybe trying to take a step back and look at this in that way would help rather than having this very, very black and white attitude.
Thank you. I don't know if anyone else wants to come in.
Very briefly, very quickly, just to build on Layla's points, which I absolutely agree with. Hezbollah is the symptom of a problem, not the problem itself. The absence of the state, I'm not going to keep, hitting this nail, but the idea that we don't have a census since 1930, we are a country that don't know how many of us live in the country. We aren't dealing with humans, we're dealing with abstract communities. And therefore, things like Hezbollah show up. That really finds easily the room to create alternative institutions, which, by the way, every other sect has. It's just that, as Layla mentioned, it's much more impressive and resourceful on Hezbollah's side. So singling it out is not going to get us anywhere, at least at the level of Lebanon. Thank
you. Really very interesting. And I think we've only got a few minutes left, but I just wanted to bring up or allow you to just end with a few comments, maybe, and if possible, on a hopeful note, but what can be learnt from the experiences of Lebanon in terms of both the successes, but also the ongoing problems of, as you've clearly identified this evening, in terms of power sharing to guide international thinking around solutions to very, very difficult problems. You know, I'm doing a lot of work at the moment on the designation of the Houthis as a terrorist organization in Yemen and the massive ramifications and implications that that's going to have, and really putting pressure on the UK government to speak out about that. But just a few words on some hopeful points coming from Lebanon, and your thoughts. John.
So kind of Lebanon is occasionally held up as this sort of model, funnily enough, for power sharing, which could be applied to other sort of civil wars in the Middle East, such as Syria, Yemen, or whatever. Obviously, we know that's a kind of deeply problematical sort of idea, given sort of the problems which we've spoken about in relationship to kind of power sharing in Lebanon. You know, I think just in terms of what's really hopeful is just looking at the kind of protests over the last year is we're beginning to see the kind of, you know, the battle lines being opened up in which the sectarian system can actually be kind of challenged. You know, it's not just about sectarianism. It's, you know, what was incredible was to see the range of actors such as queer activists. We saw migrant workers. You know, we saw a whole kind of range of kind of protest actors, you know, finding a voice. So, you know, I think maybe perhaps what's kind of hopeful is where we're beginning to see these actors begin to kind of coalesce into a more sort of coordinated movement, which can create sort of more lasting kind of change. That's, you know, the most I can say in terms of kind of hope.
That's great. We've literally only got a couple of minutes, but thank you for that. Sammy.
All right, very quickly, I would call for the following: not to sacrifice representation, a proper one, and I mean representation beyond sectarianism, and accountability for the sake of stability. I think foreign governments keep on obsessed with stability at the end of the day, of the region, of Lebanon, of other countries, Iraq, and probably and others, and they, or probably in the future Syria, and they want to impose a power sharing a la Lebanese in the sense of, you know, distribution by confession. I would caution against that. I think we need to do more serious work on accountability and representation. And just on one last point, through a work that we did with Laura Perry, professor at George Washington, I think interestingly, if you show people and you give people certain information, they tend to actually change their preferences. And one example of that is that when we gave them about the oil revenues, it's coming to Lebanon through oil discovery, how would they distribute it? You know, and in fact, when we gave it to people and showed them where the level of development by Casa, by district level, people gave it to the poorer segments. But when we gave another group the same information, but we gave them the confessions, they tended to give it to themselves, to people from their same sect. So the point that I was trying to draw is that people's preference can be shaped, and, you know, if you, in terms of what kind of information you give them. And then here I feel like there's hope, because one can actually see that people do care about others when you're actually telling them about the plight of others on a socioeconomic level, rather than focusing solely on this confessional obsession that we have over Lebanon, because I think it's much more complicated. There are many more cleavages in Lebanon than simply the confessional one that I think we need to take into account. Thank you.
Fascinating. Thank you. Ibrahim.
Two quick points. The first one, if power sharing is to be implemented anywhere else, it should be a transition, not a system. So it has to be restricted to a transitional period, not a sustainable model. That was meant to be the case with the Taif, but because they were left unwatched, it turned out to be something they can extend. And therefore, this eroded the formation of a state and a formation of economy. Instead, as I mentioned earlier, artificial economy that implodes any minute, and it just did. Artificial state that implodes any minute, and it just did. On a positive note, so that's the second and last point I have, the diaspora lost its money in Lebanon. So over $200 billion, I think, were wiped out of the savings deposits in Lebanese banks. This is the part that is not artificial about the economy. It was the money that was the diaspora putting actually back in the country, the cash, the dollars. So now they are asking questions. I'm not saying everyone is becoming politically involved, but they are asking questions. And therefore, there's a lot of hope that the diaspora plays a much bigger role in shaping the future of the country as a result of the very material reality that they've lost a lot of money, if not people and humans as well in the country, because of how mismanaged the health crisis is. And therefore, the other side of this good coin is that the people in the country are learning a lot of lessons. So people like me and others are getting politically involved. We're really learning about the durability of the system and how it reacts to crises. And this is allowing us to organize in a much more efficient way and dealing with our society in a much more efficient way. So the problem, on the long term, there's hope, but the problem is we are in this moment specifically in a very delicate situation, and the country is at the verge of collapse. And that's why I mentioned something a bit more proactive on the side of the international community. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And last but not least, Leila.
Lessons. Peace without prosperity is not worth it at all costs. And if you prioritize it to that extent, this is what you get. And looking forward, everywhere, you know, young people are the future of every country, but the young people of Lebanon are spectacular. they really, the talent they have, the ideas they have, the imagination, if you look at what they're able to create out of any situation, if you come here and look at what they're doing every day, support them, listen to them, give them visas so they can get out there, but also create opportunities for them here as well, and stop supporting an older generation that is entrenched in that, and give these kids an opportunity to build their future, because they will.
Thank you. And we've reached time, I'm afraid. Thank you so much. That was an absolutely fascinating discussion, fascinating conversation. I've certainly learnt quite a lot from you, and I think we could have gone on all evening discussing this. So I just want to thank you, contributors, the four of you. Thank you very much for your contributions, and I'll certainly take away some of this and be looking at it. And I think, although we're facing an incredibly difficult time in the international community, looking at the region and the country, hugely difficult, there is a glimmer of hope as we look to our young people. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Anna.
Thank you. Thank you.